Good morning. Today is September 13th, 2018. I'm meeting today with Mr. John Tallman at his home west of LaPorte, or north of LaPorte, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer with the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, John, and thanks for sitting down today to tell your story.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
I'm originally from Iowa. I was born on March 25th, 1947, and I think it was about 10 o'clock at night, if I remember rightly. And I lived in Clarion for we moved when I was 7 years old. And we moved to a town in Iowa called Humboldt, where I was there until the fall of '61, and then we moved to a town called Alta, Iowa, where I finished high school and worked with my dad in a cabinet shop that he owned, and went from there. After graduation, I wasn't quite ready for the military, so I decided to go to trade school before my draft number came up, and got a deferment for trade school. Went to Lincoln Technical Institute in Des Moines, Iowa for auto mechanics. And then after the auto mechanics, in September of '66, I enlisted in the Army.
You enlisted?
I enlisted, right. And I went with the idea that if I didn't serve my country, I didn't deserve to live here.
Wow. Oh.
And my dad was Army, my granddad was Navy, and my son was Army. So
A long line in the family of serving.
long line there, so
Yeah.
yes.
So you enlisted, how long, and then after you enlisted, before you took off for basic training?
2 weeks.
2 weeks?
2 weeks. Our recruiter had a scam going with everybody. We went to see the recruiter, and he says, I can just get you into this class that you want and everything else. He says, I can just get you in. If you sign now, he says, we can get you in. So there was a whole bunch of us that went, and after we got in, we found out that started every 2 weeks.
Now, was it a bunch of buddies you enlisted with? Or
I didn't enlist with a bunch of buddies. We just kind of enlisted all at different times, but there was, at one time from the little town in Iowa, there was 42 of us in Vietnam.
Is that right? Wow.
And we all came home.
Wow. Oh, good.
You know, and we all, unscathed, all of us, nothing, so.
Well, now, with all the various service branches, how did you come to choose the Army?
I went to my training in my technical school was auto mechanics, so I was interested in heavy equipment, so I took the heavy equipment operation and maintenance.
Okay.
In the military, and started out there, but I didn't end up there.
Is that right?
And everything else, but that's what I wanted. And when I got done with my training in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, they tried to get my orders to Vietnam canceled because I had done well enough at the training that they wanted to keep me as an instructor.
Okay. Uh-huh.
But they could not get my orders changed, so.
And how was that going off to basic, and that transition from civilian to military life? How was that for you?
For me, I guess it was to the point that I was ready for something new and everything else, and I was just wide open because I wanted to experience something else, because before I went in and everything else and enlisted, I didn't think I was mature enough yet, and I thought that this would help me out a lot, so, and it did considerably.
Yeah.
And everything else, and I wouldn't trade it, so.
So then from basic you went on to heavy equipment school?
I did basic in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Uh-huh.
And I did my advanced individual training, AIT, in Fort Leonard Wood. And Fort Leonard, Missouri, in the middle of winter is not a nice place to
Yeah,
be.
I heard. And the barracks are tar paper thin, and
tar paper thin and cold. And we did all of our mobilization there, doing our different classes and everything else in cattle trucks. The original cattle trucks, and that's just what they were, double-decker cattle trucks.
jeez, wow. And then from that training, then is that when your orders were to go to?
Go to Vietnam. I got a 2-week leave. They gave us 2-week leave before we had to go, and I think it was February 22nd, 1967, that I ended up overseas. And we landed in Benoit, and that's where it all started. So.
Well, how is that? I mean, here's a 20-year-old. What was that flight like? You flew over, I assume you didn't. Yeah.
Right. We left out of Fort Orde, California.
Yeah. Okay. What's that like? I mean, you're on the flight, a lot of hours of downtime to really think. I mean, do you remember if anything was going through your mind? I mean, you're flying into harm's way, more or less. What your thoughts were as you on that flight over?
My thoughts on the flight over were kind of to the point where I thought, man, I'm going to be in the engineers. I'm not going to be involved in too much. And so it was kind of relaxing for me,
oh, really?
anyway.
Okay.
And a lot of the guys were nervous, and then that would transfer over to some of the guys that weren't. So we kind of picked up on that and everything else. And the closer you got, the more you got nervous and everything else. And but it was, for me, that's hardly ever been out of the state of Iowa, so
right,
it was
right.
a all new experience and everything else. So yeah, I was kind of taking it all in, whether we just saw ocean or not. That was
Well, that's what always amazes me about these interviews. I mean, here's a small town Iowa boy halfway around the world in this exotic land. What that must have been like.
it was an eye opener and everything else. And to be honest, I enjoyed it for a while until we got to where we were getting our orders as to where we were going in Vietnam.
Yeah,
So
right.
we were in the formation area and everything else, and they would just call out names and said, "You over here, you're going here, you're going here."
So you went over as a replacement. You didn't you didn't go over as a unit.
And I went over as replacement and
Okay.
everything else. And while we were standing there getting our destinations told to us and everything else, we were initiated into the Vietnam conflict real quick because we had a helicopter crash about 200 yards from us. So, and then the next thing they wanted to know if anybody wanted to volunteer to be a door gunner on a helicopter. Everybody says, "No, I don't think you're going to get anybody there." So.
And what was that like? I know this was February, so maybe you didn't experience it, but I've heard so many people talk about when they landed and that door opened, you walked out, it was like walking into a sauna and the smells and
it was just like an oven, just like an oven. It was just that humidity hit you and everything else. And
coming from Iowa, talking about humidity bothers you there. Wow.
And it was worse than the humidity in Iowa and
right.
everything else, because it was basically 90-95% constantly and everything else, and you got your 110, 112 degrees temperatures all the time and stuff in February. So,
Wow.
And so it was an experience.
Yeah. So you're there at there, and so you got chosen into the engineers. Take your story from once you've landed and now you were told to go over here.
I was told I was going to go to Anke to join the B Company of the 84th Engineer Company. And so from there was a group of us that were going to Anke. So we got on our airplane that they were taking us up, and they took us to Quy Nhon. And we deplaned there, and there was, just like anything else, there was just a whole bunch of trucks lined up and says, "This is for this company, this is for this company," and everything else. And you got on the back of the deuce and a half with your stuff, and they just took you and dropped you where you had to go. and everything else. So that, and once we got there, it was quite nice.
Nice in what sense? That
It was the everybody there at the B Company of the 84th. It just in the headquarters there, they just made you feel comfortable, made you feel welcome. You know, it just like wasn't, you know, okay, you're a new recruit. You know, you're on the bottom of the bean pole here. You know, and you got to work your way up. But they just made us feel like we were welcome. So, and that helped a lot.
I bet.
And they just didn't drop us off in a barracks. They took us around and they introduced us to different guys that were in the platoon that you were going to be in and stuff. So it was really kind of an easy transfer. So
when you talk comfort, what about the physical comfort? So what was the camp like? You talk a little bit about your living conditions and eating.
We each had our own bunk area and everything else. Had our foot locker and our bunk, and it's just a small cubicle. Just
was it tents?
No, we had they weren't Quonset. They were open buildings. Then all they had was louvered slats up about halfway on the sides, and the top part was screens. And the louvered slats, they didn't move; they were just permanent, and it was all screened on the inside. And the lights running down the middle of it. It's tin roofs, so it could get kind of hot in there, you know.
Oh, jeez.
And it was not the best, not the worst.
Okay.
And it was a lot better than I had expected. I expected to be living in a tent and everything else, but it was a lot better than I had expected and everything else. So.
What about other feature comforts? Food. How was the food there and such?
The mess hall was not too bad. It was like the service. We got powdered eggs in the morning for breakfast and everything else. But all in all, I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, it was about a 7.
Oh, okay.
We had a real good mess sergeant and a real good mess officer and everything else, and it was decent there and everything else.
So take your story. You get settled in. Take your story from there. What were your responsibilities? Talk about it. An average day, I guess, if there was such thing.
Okay, they kind of let me go for about a week, and then after a week, the first thing they told me I was on guard duty for the night. And I thought, oh, this can't be too good. And then they says, well, you got to load yourself into these deuce and a halfs, and we'll take you out. Being we're an engineer company, we have a rock quarry, and it's not on compound. And we're going to be sitting on bulldozers as our guard towers. No communication between each other. We're just sitting out there, and a light every third dozer. And so I thought, this is not a good place to be. And so it started out relatively quiet, and we had enough guys that we changed shifts. And I was on my second shift, and I heard a noise in front of my bulldozer. So I climb down and look around the corner of the blade, and the first thing I'm looking at is a Bengal tiger about 2 feet away, face to face. And to be honest, I don't think I have ever screamed that loud in my life, you know. And to this day, I don't know why he didn't come after me or whatever, but a Bengal tiger is rather large in the wild.
Wow.
But that was my first guard duty, and I got back to the camp in the morning safe and sound, and I was ready to be safe and sound.
Oh, boy, that's something you don't train for in the Army, huh?
No, it's something I didn't even have an inkling that something like that would ever happen.
That's a hell of a story.
But I can still close my eyes and think about it, and I can still see the fangs on his.
Wow.
Yeah. And after that, I was assigned to the motor pool, and they had just built a new motor pool, so it was kind of nice where we had a concrete work floor and nice shade and everything else and high ceiling so it didn't get real hot in there and everything else. And I worked in the motor pool for probably 3 months doing different things, doing repairs and doing some book work. And with my carpenter experience that I had, the warrant officer wanted to redo our tool room to make it a little bit more efficient. And his ideas and my ideas of being efficient were different. So we had a little discussion that ended up with me being transferred to the construction platoon. He didn't like my ideas, but I found out later after being in the construction platoon that we had to go back and change the tool room as to what I told him we should do in the first place. So, and then in the construction platoon we were working on, when I got there the company had just finished building the tank farm for the fuels and stuff there, and we were just finishing up the airstrip in Ankei. And we were there for, I guess, just right about the time that I got transferred into the construction platoon. There was a rumor that B Company, the 84th Engineers, was being shipped back to the States. So everybody was kind of party happy and everything else. And then to come to find out, they took just our company colors and reassigned us as the B Company of the 589th Engineers. So everybody that was in the 589th that didn't get to come over, they got to go to the 84th Engineers in the States, and we got to become their company.
Oh no! Oh no!
So we did a lot there in Ankei. We did a lot of patrolling the highway between Ankei and Pleiku, part way anyway. We were kind of in charge of mine detection on the highway.
Is this Highway 1?
Highway 1.
And where in country were you? General idea, up north, central, down?
Kind of central.
Okay.
And it was I-Corps 2, and or Corps 2, whatever it was. And we were pretty much central, but we were in called the Highlands.
Okay.
And everything else, and it was kind of funny. It was hotter than the blue blazes during the day, but at nighttime, 70 degrees, 80 degrees, we were all running around in field jackets because it was cold.
Yeah,
with the humidity,
yeah,
and stuff. Yeah. And but we did a lot of mine sweeping. I've had some experiences there in mine sweeping that were enough to scare me. So, and everything else, and then from Ankei we were sent TDY to Pleiku. And in Pleiku we built some hangars and some barracks in Pleiku. And from Pleiku we went to Way to build a base for a helicopter base up in Way. And we were pretty much under attack just as much as we were in Ankei, because in Ankei we were right next door to the first air cav. So Charlie was after the first air cav. So, but we got Way, and we were under rocket attack every night. And it was just right after the 67 Tet offensive that we were
68 offensive? Oh yeah. Oh boy.
and everything else that we were up there. And I got in trouble in Way with my platoon leader, the lieutenant, because we were pouring concrete late, and I was on the concrete finish detail, and we came under attack, so they had to turn out our lights so they couldn't bear, and so we're trying to finish concrete on a pad for our barracks in the dark, And we got done with what we thought we were done with and everything else, and went back to our tents. We were sleeping in tents and went to our tents, and 6:30 in the morning, lieutenant's shaking me to wake me up, and he was lucky I wasn't ready to pop somebody, but he was chewing me out upside down and backwards and everything else because we had missed a spot in the middle of the concrete. It was about 6 inches around, and unfortunately for me, and lucky enough for me, that I picked up my rifle, but I didn't have a clip in it, but he didn't realize this, and I told him to get the hell out. And so he did, and I thought, oh man, I'm in really deep trouble. Nothing ever came of it. But the only bad part about that was 3 weeks later, he became our company commander. So, and then after we went to Hawaii, we went back to Quinyon, and then we were there for a while, and we were still doing basically mine sweeps and everything else.
What's that all involved? I mean, what in a mine sweep? What goes on? What part did you play in that? What would you do?
I was running the mine detector.
Oh,
It's just like the old sweeps that you go out looking for treasures in on the beach or whatever, and we could not have metal on us, so boot eyelets were a no-no because they were metal and they would set off the thing, and no belt buckles, no jewelry, whatever, watch or whatever, we couldn't do that. And we proceeded to go out, and I had one guy follow me, and if I detected something that this was detecting, he would get down on his hands and knees behind me, and I would spread my legs, and he would crawl underneath my legs with a bayonet and probing the ground to see if there was anything there. And man, I think I was on probably at least 12 to 15 details that way. Otherwise than that, I was just kind of out there. And the first air cab pulled our security. And at the one time I was probably out about 50 yards in front of everybody else, and all of a sudden there was a bunch of poofs in the ground around us. And then you heard the rat-a-tat-tat, and you just froze because you had no place to go. You didn't know, you'd had to turn around and run in the exact same footprints that you took. In the first air cab, they took off to the woods and everything else, and did a little bit of shooting there, and they came back and said it was taken care of. So, but that's as close as I want to be.
Yeah, geez. Wow.
And everything else. So.
As you guys moved around at various camps, did you primarily stay in camp, or would you ever go into one of the villages? Did you have any interaction with the local civilians at all?
I didn't have any interactions with the locals or anything because I didn't. I guess I got to the point where I wasn't comfortable with the locals.
Yeah. Well,
in town and everything else, because we always heard the stories about the little kids with the shoe shine kits and everything else, and so I just decided, time out. I'll spend my time here and go to the NCO club or whatever, or go to the PX and get something to bide my time and everything else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you had a different war than your father's in many ways, and one of them was, in your father's war, you knew the front line was 6 clicks up the road, whereas with you never knew friend or foe.
We didn't know friend or foe and everything else. And then after our stay there in Ankei, we went to Phan Rang, and we moved our whole company down there. We had moved everything down to Quinyon, loaded it on LSTs for the Navy, and we took a boat ride down to Phan Rang. And I was in Phan Rang for possibly a little over a year, I believe.
How long of a tour did you have?
I went over in February of 1967, and I came home in May of 1969.
Did you re-op for a second tour, or how did you?
Over there we could extend our tour of duty 6 months, and with an extension of a tour of duty of 6 months, we got a 30-day non-chargeable leave. They would fly us home and fly us back, so we got extra 30-day leave. So that's, in fact, my first leave was before we left K and everything else. And kind of backtracking here a little bit.
No, that's fine.
I left early of my year update by about 2 weeks. And the day I left, that night, my bunk area was hit with a mortar round. And everything else. So I was glad I left.
Yeah.
But in that, that was probably about the worst for me anyway. Coming home and having a hole where your bunk used to be, was a patch in the roof. So,
In addition to those extended or those trips home, did you get your R&R? Did you take any R&R trips?
I did not take any R&R trips because at that time I was kind of into cars, and I was paying for a Corvette in the garage. So it was, and everything else. So I just decided and to this day I regret not taking an R&R, because I had my chances. I could go to Thailand, I could go to Japan, I could go to Australia, and I bypassed it. And to this day I regret it and stuff. So.
But you were able to take that 30-day. You came home for
30 days.
And what was that like? I can't imagine. Once again, a different story than your dad's war, where it took weeks to travel back and forth. I mean, 1 minute you're in a war zone, and 24 hours later you're back in civilization. What was that?
It was the first trip was really eerie, because I didn't know what to expect because of all the protests and everything else.
So you guys were getting word about that back?
We were getting a lot of words about that back there and everything else. And
how'd that play psychologically on everybody's mind over there?
It with me, it didn't set well.
Yeah.
And everything else, because granted, it was a war that wasn't well accepted and everything else, but it was what the country was involved in. And if that's the case, then you go with the flow,
yeah.
And everything else. But so I had quite a different opinion of what everybody else had. But my worst part about coming home the first time was being called a baby killer, and that was in the airport in Omaha, Nebraska.
Really?
And stuff. And I just looked at the lady and I says, "You have no idea what goes on." And stuff. So, but my leave home was relatively different, because my mother was not thrilled with the idea of me going back, and I told her, I says, I wouldn't be going back if I did not feel that I was pretty much in a safe place. But after we got to Fanrang, we were on an Air Force base. So we were pretty much safe and everything else, because they weren't after us, they were after airplanes and everything else. And we built a lot of bridges and stuff on Highway 1, and rebuilt them numerous times because Charlie didn't want to see a bridge, so we ended up finally putting culverts in. And but Fanrang was all right duty and everything else, because at that time I got to be a Jeep driver. I was an E5 and became a Jeep driver for a lieutenant that was one of these guys that I would just give him the shirt off my back,
Yeah.
because he was just one of the boys, whether it didn't make any difference, and everybody in our platoon just would do anything for the man and everything else. So I became his Jeep driver, and pretty much had a easy life for about 9 months.
And that's the tail end of that of your time over.
My time over there, yeah, because when I was in Fan Rang, I extended once and everything else. So, and that time my trip home was not good. So, but I didn't mind that so much. But I knew it was a decision I had made. So it was what I thought was right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and everything else. But I did spend my 20th, 21st, and 22nd birthdays in Vietnam. So, so when I got out, I was ready to party.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And everything else. But my military experience, I would not trade. And like I say, I learned a lot. It taught me a lot, and everything else. So I'm happy with how it came out. So.
Yeah. How was that that last flight out when your tour was up and you're flying home? You remember the feeling when the wheels left the ground and you thought, "Boy, I made it out of here," or
my last trip home was the trip from hell.
I'm not talking about your second trip home. I'm talking your final.
My last trip.
Oh,
Was the trip from hell.
Oh, geez.
And it started in Vietnam. Our plane that we were supposed to take broke down. So here we are, ready to go home. They've taken everything we got, all except for the clothes we're traveling in, and our personal belongings. That's all we got left. It took them 3 days to get us a replacement airplane.
Oh, jeez.
So we kind of lived in the same set of fatigues for 3 days, because there was nobody there to do laundry. We could just take them to the shower stall and kind of rinse them out and hang them up, and everything else. And we flew back on Seaboard World Airlines, owned by Lady Bird Johnson. And we flew into Hawaii. Our airplane missed the runway twice. On the third time, we made it, bounced 2 times, and ran off the end of the runway.
Jeez.
And this was in the middle of the night, and they carried the pilot off on a stretcher. We figured he had been a little on the inebriated side. So then we had to spend all night in the airport so they could fly a new crew over from the States to bring us home. So, and the airport was basically deserted that time of the night and everything else. So you got 180 some guys running around the airport, and the bars were all closed, and they ended up having to call people in, and they opened up the bars and stuff, and that was about it. And we got back to Fort Lewis, Washington, probably a few days late. So.
And at that point, did you muster out then, or did you still have time left on your enlistment?
I mustered out, because with my extensions and everything else, I came back to the States with 149 days. And with 149 days, they had a deal that if you came back to the States with 150 days or less, they would not reassign you, because it cost them too much money to reassign somebody. They just let us go. So I got it. At that time, they called them an early out, but I got credit for my enlistment time and everything else. So I just had to spend 150 days extra in the reserves that never had to make a meeting. So, but that was it. So.
Yeah. And kind of the sister question to an earlier question, then how was that transition for you, going from the military particularly with everything you had experienced in Vietnam, back to civilian life, was that much of an adjustment for you at all?
It was a big adjustment and everything else because it was to the point where, you know, we were basically under orders all the time, didn't have any, you know, and you're kind of used to being told where you got to go, what you got to do, and when you got to do it. And just to be on your own all of a sudden, because when they mustered us out, I don't think I was in the getting mustered out for more than an hour from the time I walked into the building until I walked out and everything else. So they didn't give you any inkling as to what to expect, anything. They just says, okay, you're done, you're gone.
Huh, wow.
And so it was an adjustment time for me, but even at that, you know, because it's with the time delay and everything else.
Yeah, right.
It was, I was ready to party and everybody else was sleeping, so, you know, and so it took a long time to get used to that,
Yeah.
And everything else. So.
Was there any option or any thought to making it a career, or were you?
I thought about it and everything else, but there was the point at sometimes that I thought it was just too Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
You know, and everything else. You know, it's the reason I did my extension was that I'd be going to Germany. They were sending everybody that came from there, sending them to Germany. And at Germany, they were playing war games. And I thought, well, as long as I'm here, I just as well get paid to be in a war game. You know, and because pay wasn't that. I think my combat pay was $50 a month. And stuff. And even being an E5, you don't get that much because you're no time and grade, because that's how your pay scale was based on, is time and grade. So that's why I decided to do what I did. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So you returned back to Iowa. Did you take some downtime, or did you get right back into things? What was it like?
I took some downtime a little bit. I wanted to just kind of get back into seeing what civilian life was really like on an extended stay rather than a 30-day stay.
Right.
On an extended stay and everything else. So I just kind of went around and did a lot of. I did a little bit of traveling in Iowa, back and forth. I went back down to Des Moines where I had gone to school and seen some of the old instructors and everything else. And at one time I went over and saw my sister in college and everything else. So that was kind of nice and got me back into seeing what was really going on, civilian life type stuff and everything else. So, but after a while, I did start back to work with my dad, and then I decided I was going to go back to being a mechanic. And I got a job with a friend, high school friend, and as a international dealer, as a truck mechanic in Cherokee, Iowa. And Orrin was a high school buddy, and the last probably 9 weeks that we were in Vietnam, we were stationed 400 feet apart.
Oh, is that right? Huh.
So my last little bit in Vietnam was just basically a party and everything. Could get to be 90 days. They called us short timers because they said, yeah, short timers, 90 days. We don't want to put you in too much harm's way. So it was pretty easy deal. And in fact, I did have it pretty easy for quite a while over there because when we were in Encave, my first sergeant there in the company was from Iowa, and there was 6 of us from Iowa. So the Iowa guys did no Sunday duty.
Good, great.
And everything else. So we had a good time and everything else. So it was, to me, it was time well spent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any issues when you got back, or even to this day, with flashbacks or nightmares or anything like that? Or were you able to put it kind of behind you?
I could not watch a real war movie for, in fact, I still have trouble with some of them because the real war movies, rather than these fictitious ones, are a little bit more true to form as to what it was, and I have trouble with those. I have trouble with fireworks. Even to this day, I still have trouble with fireworks because fireworks, I'll have nightmares for 2 or 3 days after the
right?
4th of
Wow,
July.
wow.
So.
So then, from the time on, then you went on as a career as a mechanic. Then
I went along for a while until I guess the boss had a guy that got into him financially and everything else, so he sent me out as a truck driver to help the guy so he could pay his bills. And the truck that he gave me was overheight and overweight and questionable brakes,
oh boy,
and I came down a hill into a curve and laid it over sideways because I couldn't get her to slow down, even downshift, and she wouldn't take it. And so then after that, I went to North Dakota to work on my uncle's ranch up in North Dakota for probably 8 months, I think it was, and then after that I moved back to Iowa and stuff, and pretty much stayed there for a while, and then I moved to Colorado.
what brought you to Colorado?
There was 5 of us, took a weekend to come out to Colorado and everything else, and I loved it and everything else, and I went back and just kind of packed up my stuff, and two of the other guys that came out did the same thing. We came out to Denver, and I got a job working construction right away and everything else, and loved it. The one guy stayed maybe 4 days, and he moved back to Iowa because his granddad was a farmer and he bought a new tractor and he wanted to farm with a new tractor. And the other guy stayed quite a while, and I rode to work with the foreman that I worked for, lived in the same apartment complex where I lived, and he picked me up one morning and I rode to work with him because my other roommate, his car was on the fritz and he needed to borrow mine, and in the process he was supposed to pick me up at night and never did. He wrecked my car.
Not the Corvette, hopefully.
No, not the Corvette. I had a SS 396 El Camino.
Oh, wow.
He piled that up pretty good for me and everything else, and but I pretty much stayed out there. He left after that, and I stayed out there and worked. I got a job working for a cabinet installation company for kitchens, because that's basically what my dad did. He was a cabinet maker, and that's basically what I was trained at. And went to work for the guy and everything else, and loved it, and just liked Colorado, and stayed that way. So
That's what you went on for a career as a cabinet maker then?
after I think I got married in '72, and we lived out there for a while, had a house built, lived in that for a while and everything else, and then my dad and my mother were there, and my mother passed away. And he was working in the same business. He bought into the business where I was working, and then after my mother passed away, things didn't go well for my dad, and he went to North Dakota where my grandparents lived, but I stayed in Colorado, and then he was kind of pressuring me to come up there because his cabinet shop was pretty busy. So we went to North Dakota, to a little town called Fortuna. It was 6 miles from the Canadian border and 11 from Montana. and we lived up there for 14 years. And then we kind of went our separate ways, and I moved back to Colorado in '89. So.
Talk a little bit about family.
Family, I have three sisters. I have three kids. And let me see, my one sister's 5 years older than I am, and my other two sisters, one's 3 years younger and the other one's 2 years younger. And then I got my three kids. I have two daughters and a son. My oldest daughter and my son live in Minot, North Dakota. My middle daughter lives in Salt Lake City. My oldest daughter is a LPN and works for a medical clinic for the hospital there. My son is, I forget, 36, I think he is now. And he works for a construction company where he started out as a mechanic for him because he had gone to Wyoming Tech, for training, and he did that through the National Guard. But he started working for this construction company, and he had worked for them for probably 6 years, and then with the National Guard he was 2 tours in Afghanistan. He spent one of his tours in the States but got credit for Afghanistan. He spent 1 tour over in Afghanistan.
How was that time for you, knowing, at one time being in a combat zone? What was it like as a father to have a son over in a combat zone?
That is when I first realized what my folks had gone through when I was in a combat zone. And I can see why things went that way with them and everything else, with the fact that I was going back twice and everything else. So I come to a real eye-opener in that stage as to what kind of pressure it puts you under. And the only thing that made a big difference to me was my correspondence with my parents was through a letter.
Right, yeah.
My correspondence through my son was a cell phone call.
Right, yeah.
Which was just boggled my mind that he could sit in Afghanistan on a cell phone and call me. Because when I was in Vietnam, we had no access to telephone with the company and stuff that I was with. We did not have that access and everything else. So that was the only real soft spot for me with him being over there and everything else. And he was on a listening post. And he told me one day that he was reading the license plates on a vehicle that was 5 miles away. So that's, that kind of told me that even being in a listening post, you're kind of in a target area. If they wanted to do anything, you were in a target area. But that was a saving grace for me with him being over there, was the telephone calls.
Well, I kind of deviated off. You're talking about the children, and you've talked about your daughter and your son. What about your third daughter?
My third daughter, that's a story where we won't go.
Okay.
And
fair enough.
Everything else, so we just leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. And grandchildren?
Grandchildren, I have 5. My son has 4. My oldest daughter has 1. Addison just turned 10. That's with my daughter. Andy's kids is Caden, he's 11. Gracie's 10. Tegan is 6. And the youngest just turned a year. So it's got our hands full. We go up there. We try to make it up there once a year. So got to keep an eye on them, you know. So
Yeah, yeah.
but that's the. It's something I never thought I was going to have with grandkids.
Is that right? Yeah.
You know, and everything else. But I'm happy I do.
Yeah.
I just don't get to see them enough.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's when I'm there, I make the most of it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and my daughter was here this summer, and we made the most of that trip when she was here. So we did.
Wonderful.
We did a lot. So.
And Bonnie, you talk about how you met Bonnie and
Bonnie, I met dancing one night. I was a chairman of a divorced, widowed, separated, and single group, and they were having a line dance lesson, and I was moving the next day. This was on a Friday night, and I was moving the next day, Saturday morning. I was moving to Estes Park to go to work for a fella up there in construction, building the houses. And I went to this dance lessons, and because I just made my presence known, and being as I was chairman. So then I was on my way home to pack. I hadn't packed anything, and I says, "Oh, my favorite band's playing at the Holiday Inn. I had better go check it out." And I was sitting there at the bar having a drink and talking to some people, and Bonnie walked in, and that's all it took for me. So we danced most of the night, and we got together after that and everything else, and it's been great ever since. So,
oh, wonderful.
and in fact, my first experience with her was she invited me over for supper on a Mother's Day one day, and got over there, and all but two of her kids were in the backyard with their families. So I got initiated right quick, you know, so but it's been great ever since.
Yeah,
so.
wonderful.
And, we enjoy it out here. We lived in Loveland, had a house down there, and then we got the horses, and decided that we needed an acreage for the horses, and we found this place where we're at, and we've been here for 11 years now, so and we just love it out here. So.
Oh, wonderful. Through the years, did you ever keep in touch with any of the guys you served with? Has there been any sort of reunions, anything like that?
I have not. When I first went to North Dakota to work with my uncle on the ranch the first time and everything else, one of the guys stopped by where I lived in Iowa, but I wasn't there. And unfortunately, my dad didn't give him any information as to where I was at. Because I would have loved to have seen him, because I have since been when I started going through my dad's stuff, I got back on the internet and found out that there is a 589th Engineers Association. And I have found a couple of the guys that I was over there with on that, and the guy that stopped to see me has passed away. So that was kind of a shock when you start knowing the guys you served with are starting to go. So, but I intend to try to get a hold of some of them and everything else, because it's important. I get together. I call my friend that I was in high school with, that we were over there together with. In fact, we went to a wedding in March, and on the way home we stopped and spent the night with him, and we did a lot of reminiscing and everything
Oh,
else.
wow. Wow.
But I would like to get back in touch with some of the guys I was over there with.
Yeah, yeah. Any worries? I know there's the big issue with Agent Orange, and I mean, just living in jungle conditions. Have you had any health worries or anything in regards to? Were you even exposed to any? Do you figure in any Agent Orange?
I don't think I was exposed to it and everything else, because what our company did when we were working on the road and everything else, we had what they called the roam plows and everything else, and they just got into it just like the old snowplows get into a gang going down the highway. These guys got about 6, 7 wide, and just started bulldozing a path down the edge of the road rather than the defoliage spray
Okay.
and everything else. So I have had no thoughts of Agent Orange
Oh, good.
at all.
Good,
So
good.
because knock on wood, my health is really pretty good.
Yeah.
Excuse me, for what I've been through and everything else, and
Yeah.
what we do and stuff. And, being healthy is kind of nice at this age.
Yeah. Have you been back, or do you have any desire to go back to visit Vietnam?
I have no desire
Yeah.
whatsoever to go back, because it's, I don't know why. A lot of guys want to go back, but it's just to see how it's changed, but I have no desire to see how much it's changed and everything else, because I've got enough pictures to remind me of what it was like and
Yeah.
where it was at and
Yeah.
everything else, and so.
And what are your thoughts now, after we've had 50 years to kind of chew on the war? What were your thoughts then compared to now? I mean, I guess just the general question. What are your thoughts on that war?
My thoughts in that war have not changed in my thinking as to why and everything else. It's just what the country was involved in at the time, and I thought it was right, and I still think it was right to do what we did. Whether people back here agreed with it or not, that's my take on it. I thought it was right, and I'll go to my grave thinking that it was what should have been done, and glad that I was a part of it. The only drawback to it is the disrespect we got for it and everything else, and being called names and everything else, and along that line. And with my trip on the honor flight on May 6th and 7th of this year, I have totally changed, not totally changed, it has just improved my image as to what I feel as being a veteran. It's, had never gotten that much respect as a veteran as we did on this honor flight, and it has just totally improved my thoughts. I was always proud of being a veteran, and now it's just tenfold more than I ever thought,
Good.
and everything else. And I'm not afraid to let anybody know that I'm a veteran, as to where we used to be, just kind of hide back
Right.
in the corner,
Right.
But
Right.
now anymore, I'm not afraid to let anybody know that I'm a veteran, and I'm proud of the fact that I'm a veteran.
As you should be. Yeah. Well, as we start to wind down this interview, John, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? Any other stories that have kind of come to the surface you want to talk about? And Bonnie, join in if you can think of anything he's left out, so that ideally, I know we probably only got the tip of the iceberg of your story, but ideally rounded out your story as best we can, or do you think we've covered everything you want to?
I probably have a few stories that I could tell that I don't know would be appropriate for my kids to hear.
Okay.
And everything else, but we did. I did a lot of things over there. Some I'm proud of, some I'm not proud of, and everything else. And I guess my biggest story that I guess is my favorite story is that when I was just about through with my service, and I was stationed close to Orrin Huseman, which was a good buddy, still is a good buddy, and a high school friend. I was at his company area with another friend that I had. His name was Leonard Reed, and he was from California, and we had gone down to Orrin's company area to party a little bit because we were both short timers, and they were on sandbag detail. And Orrin said to me, he says, "Hey, I just got the new newspaper from the hometown back in Iowa." And he says, "It's up laying on my bunk." I says, "Oh, okay." He says, "We got to do this for about few minutes more. And I says, okay. He says, why don't you go up and read it, you know. So I go up to his area in the barracks, and I pick up the paper, and Leonard goes, sits in the area across from me, and I'm standing there reading the paper, leaning against his wall locker, and I got the paper up in front of me. And I hear a bunch of people walk in the barracks. So I just figured it was these guys coming back. And I've got the paper in front of me, I'm not paying any attention. And the guy says, you don't salute an officer when you come in, when he comes in the barracks. I said, yeah, if I see one of them SOBs, you know, and everything else, because I thought it was these guys playing a joke on me. He says, well, what do you consider an officer? I says, got to be bird colonel or above. You know, anything else is just one of the guys. He says, well, why don't you put down your paper? So as I drop the paper, I can see just out of the corner when I'm starting to fold it, I can see Leonard over in the other barracks, and I mean, this boy is standing rigid. Standing rigid. And so I put the paper down and I look. There's a full bird colonel, a light colonel, a major, a captain, a lieutenant, and a warrant officer. And the guy, colonel, is standing right in front of me, just looking at me. You know? And to be honest, my hair was probably as long as it is right now. Sideburns were probably the same length.
Oh, geez.
And everything else. And he says to me, he says, how long have you been here? I says, where? And he says, right here. And I looked at my watch and says, probably about 10, 20 minutes. He says, no. He says, how long have you been here? In country. And I says, well, right as of right now, I says, 24 months. And he looks at me and he says, oh. He says, when's the last time you had a haircut? I says, the last time I went home. And I'd had one in between, but I was already in deep trouble, so I figured I'd stay in deep trouble. He says, do you consider me an officer? I says, well, I says, looks like it's a bird colonel. I says, yes, sir. You know, he says, would you give me a salute? So I just kind of nonchalantly saluted him, and he says, thank you. And he says, well, what company are you with? I says, B Company, 589th Engineers. And he says, okay, thank you. And they just kind of went on their business and walked through the barracks, and I'm standing there, and he says, well, before he left, he actually says, he says, I think you better go back to your company area. So, well, okay, yeah, I won't argue, you know. So Leonard and I walked back to our company area, and about an hour later, Orrin comes up to my company area, and he says, what'd you do? I says, what? He says, we just had to stand in formation for half an hour getting a lecture on military etiquette. What is right? I says, oh, well, okay. I says, so I kind of told him what had gone on, and he says, wow. He says, and you're still alive? You know? I says, yeah. So we kind of partied that night. Next morning, worked formation, everything else we got going along, and first they call a formation to order, and the first thing first sergeant says, Tallman. Yes, first sergeant. Orderly room, now. Oh, doggers, here it comes, you know. So, and as it would be, the company commander was the same guy that I had gotten in trouble with.
Oh, no.
Up in the mountains in a way. And his name was Lieutenant Greer. And I go in and report, says, Tallman reporting. He says, Tallman, he says, do anything last night? I said, yeah. And he says, do you go any place? I said, yeah. And I says, in fact, if you're asking me this question, you know where I was at. He says, yeah. He says, I got a phone call last night. He says, I'm supposed to try to teach my troops some respect. I says, well, you know and I know as to what I think about some officers. And I says, good and bad. He says, yeah, he says, but the only thing I'm asking you, he says, never tell him again about you're with the 589th Engineers, B Company. And he says, you're done. And I walked out the door. So I luckily enough, nothing ever got. And I had the philosophy when I went in a private E1, I could leave private E1. But lucky enough, I left as a specialist 5E5. So.
Wow, that's a great story.
You know, but it's, and I imagine to this day that colonel's probably telling the same story about Specialist Tallman.
Well, the last question I like to ask in these interviews is, as you look back on your time in the Army, in particular your time in Vietnam, do you look at it as something that changed, affected, or played a role in your life, or was it simply a chapter in your life they went through? How would you answer that?
To me, it changed me a lot. And because to the fact that I was just, I don't consider myself a smart-ass kid anymore, and everything else. And it taught me, I was in some trouble with some people. It taught me about learning and doing the respect part of it, and everything else. And I've run that through my mind numerous times about, had I not done that, had I not have the respect for some people that I have nowadays.
Yeah. Wow. Well, John, I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story, but just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, I thank you. I appreciate that very much. So. This is Benoit Formation area, and this was my introduction into Vietnam. Helicopter crashed while we were getting our orders to where we were going to be stationed, and that was within an hour after being in country.
Wow.
That is me in Anke. I had written to the governor of Iowa at the time, and to this day I can't remember his name, and said that most of the guys in the company were flying their state flags, and I needed one from the state of Iowa, and that is the flag that he sent me.
Huh.
That is me and my two best friends when I was stationed in Anke. The guy with no shirt, his name was Robert Hines, and the guy in the middle is Efren Gonzalez, and his nickname was Speedy. And we were all together for a year and everything else, and we were kind of like the three amigos. And Robert Hines, if I remember right, was from New Jersey, and Speedy was from Crystal Lakes, Illinois.
Did you pick up a nickname while you were over there?
No, I didn't. Just lucky enough I didn't. So this is me at the aircraft hangar in Way, and I don't know if you can read the nail apron I have on, but my dad sent that to me from the lumberyard in Alta, Iowa. It says Alta Lumber Company, and I sent a copy of this picture back to them, and they posted it in the lumberyard for years until it went out of business. So.
Wow.